Disco Elysium is a brilliant, hilarious, and visionary game that quickly took the industry by storm and cemented its place as an absolute all-timer. But the history of the game as a concept, and even through development and release, was an arduous and often scandalous one. So follow me as we tackle the history of this incredible game and uncover the apparent darkness of the gaming industry. Before we start, my name's Lakin. I'm an author and a content creator. If you enjoy the video, do make sure to subscribe. Without further ado, in typical essay fashion, we're going all the way back to the beginning. Disco Elysium was first conceptualized by Robert Kurvitz, an Estonian novelist best known previously for a novel called Sacred and Terrible Air, published in 2013 that takes place in the same universe as the game, even though the game didn't exist yet. To be frank with you, and yes, I've read it, it's not great. And apparently the negative reception of the book caused Kurvitz to fall to alcoholism as a coping method. However, once he managed to dig himself out of that hole, the beginnings of what we now call Disco Elysium started to shine through. But the origins of Sacred and Terrible Air and the world that it lives in take us back a long while to a part that's also essential to the tale. Kurvitz's band. In 2001, he was part of a band called Ultra Melonhool. In 2005, while he and his bandmates were getting drunk, they apparently made up this fictional world in their stupor. They decided to expand on the idea, and in the process recruited oil painter Alexander Rostov, who will become quite important. With this, since Kurvitz was a fan of tabletop RPGs, they created a game based on Dungeons & Dragons, only in a steampunkish world. It was around this time that Kurvitz met another Estonian author, Kar Kender, who helped him write his notorious failure, Sacred and Terrible Air. When the dust settled on this early stage, Kender made a suggestion to Kurvitz that started everything. He told him that he should quit writing novels and instead seek to capture the world he'd created in a video game, something Kender thought would draw larger interest. This would eventually lead to the founding of Zom in 2016, the company that would go on to make Disco Elysium. Kurvitz's original pitch for Disco Elysium was as follows. D&D meets a 70s cop show in an original, fantastic realist setting with swords, guns, and motor cars, realized as an isometric CRPG, a modern advancement of the legendary Planescape, Torment, and Baldur's Gate. Massive reactive story exploring a vast poverty-stricken ghetto, deep strategic combat. And really, the combat is just about the only thing in this original pitch that didn't come to pass. All in all, the original pitch sounds fairly close to what we actually got, only one thing was missing. When the game was announced in 2017, it was under the name No Truce with Furies, obviously quite different from the final title. Anyways, it wasn't long before Kurvitz could secure capital. Zom relocated from Estonia to London and Brighton. They found themselves with 20 outside consultants and 35 in-house developers, also working with an English band called Sea Power to make the music for the game. Most of the funding came from an Estonian businessman named Margus Linnamäe. And so now the stage is set. Disco Elysium was settled upon as the final name. It released, and then released under the most well-known and critically acclaimed version, Disco Elysium: The Final Cut, which was announced in 2020 and expanded on the original with voiceovers and narration. The original released in 2020 and the Final Cut released in 2021. From here, the problems began, or rather, they'd already begun. Before we go any further, if you've been enjoying the video before the juicy bits, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Alright, and now on to the legal battles. First of all, it's important to share all sides. Before I say what I'm going to say, it's worth noting that the public perception of Kurvitz is not that great. Apparently the production of Disco Elysium involved significant crunch, and Kurvitz himself was a less than ideal boss. Even so, he ended up being the lesser evil, paling in comparison to the insane legal tricks the next person I'll introduce managed to pull. Soon after the release of the original Disco Elysium, and even before the Final Cut, work on a sequel began. However, in 2022, Kurvitz, Rostov, lead writer Helen Heinpeer, and another Zom member named Martin Luiga all left the company, quote-unquote, involuntarily. But why? Recall Margus Linnamäe, the investor I mentioned a few paragraphs ago. Well, he owned the majority shares of the company, and Kurvitz seemed satisfied enough with this arrangement, until Margus's shares were acquired by Tutrek OU, a holding company owned by the then CEO of Zom, Ilmar Kompis, who is arguably the villain of this story. Technically, this would have been fine and good. In fact, on paper it might even seem like a good thing, since Zom was no longer owned primarily by an outside investor. What later came out about Ilmar was anything but good, however. Kurvitz and Rostov claimed that the funds Ilmar used for the purchase were pulled from the studio itself. That's right, Ilmar Compass had allegedly funneled the funds for the company for which he was the CEO through an outside holdings company for the purpose of acquiring majority shares for himself. Goes without saying that this is considered a fraudulent purchase, which is obviously wildly illegal. It wasn't long before Kurvitz and Rostov began their complaints and challenged the purchase, looking to recover their IP from Zom. Since the rights to Disco Elysium lay with Zom, the IP rights to their own game were now laying with a foreign entity. Ilmar didn't stop there, though. Apparently, he purchased a bunch of sketches from Zom meant as concept art for Disco Elysium 2 for a measly €1 and sold them back to Zom for 4.8 million euros. This was a transaction he would have had full control of as a CEO and allowed him to entirely recoup the money spent to acquire Zom in the first place. Of course, Kurvitz and Rostov witnessed the changes in the company's structure and such, continuing to raise complaints about it, which resulted in them being demoted and eventually fired along with Heinpier and Luiga. Kurvitz and Rostov, of course, argued that they should still retain some control over the IP rights for Disco Elysium. They did create it, after all. Zom, however, shrugged off the charges, stating that the two were let go for causing a disruptive environment at the studio and discriminated and abused against other employees. A statement which, it seems, could be equally as true as the allegations against Zom themselves. Zom employees, as well, have been on record to say that the situation wasn't black and white, quote-unquote. Kar Kender, executive producer of Disco Elysium, was next to raise similar questions and was also the next to be fired. He, however, was the first to take it to court in a case in which Kurvitz himself appeared. The case resulted in Compass paying the 4.8 million back to Zom, but unfortunately precious little other than that. In 2023, Zom stated publicly that the legal actions of the former employees were concluded. Kender divested all of his shares in the studio and repaid the studio's legal fees under court order. As for Kurvitz and Rostov, Zom alleges that their lawsuit was dropped due to lack of evidence, but most of the details in this particular case are confidential. Kurvitz and Rostov themselves, however, claim that Zom's statement on the matter was misleading. They believe that Zom is seeking to paint them as disgruntled employees purely because they're the two remaining minority shareholders in the company. Essentially, Zom sees them as a threat. They went on to state that they, quote-unquote, plan to pursue legal options accordingly. Following the firing of Rostov, Kurvitz, and Heinpier, there were a few attempts to continue making sequels and expansions, one of which was cancelled, the other of which seems to be in some sort of development hell as of 2023. As of 2024, Zom is laying off 25% of the staff, primarily targeting women and team members who have been on record complaining about the working conditions at the studio. PC Gamers reported that the only remaining work being done at Zom was a Disco Elysium mobile game and a seemingly unrelated RPG. And that's how it ended. Zom seems to be going down the hole. Meanwhile, Kurvitz and Rostov are continuing their legal battle against Zom to win back the rights of their own game, which was unjustly stolen from them. Combined, the duo haven't even seen a fraction of the profits that the wildly popular game has made thus far. It's unclear now if Kurvitz wants to simply make another game, or if he'll continue to fight until he can win back his baby. Regardless, I hope that one day the feud can come to an end and we'll at last be able to see the sequel made under the watchful eyes of the true creators of the game. If you want to play Disco Elysium, it's best not to give Zom money. I'm not going to give you piracy methods here in this video, but most of you will know where to find them, and I'm sure people in the comments section would be more than willing to tell you how. This has been the insane tale of Disco Elysium's development and the extremely questionable legal battles that followed. If you enjoyed, slam that subscribe button and drop a comment down below. I love you all, and I'll see you next time. Ciao!